Today's lesson is entitled Chiasmus in the Book of Mormon. The instructor is John W. Welch. He received his Juris Doctorate degree from Duke University. He is an instructor of law at Brigham Young University and editor of BYU Studies.
Our lecture today deals with the topic of chiasmus in the Book of Mormon. I'll explain what that is as we go along. In 1967, while I was serving as a missionary in Regensburg, Germany, I was fortunate to be in the right place at the right time to make what has been, for me, a very interesting discovery. Before getting started, let me remind you of a significant thing in approaching the Book of Mormon. I think it's important for us to read the Book of Mormon for a number of different purposes. The book is a very rich book, and it contains many different sorts of things in it, so we have to read it from different angles and for different purposes, and indeed we understand it at different points in our life in different ways as we go along. There are different academic tools that we can use to understand different parts of the book, and it's one of those books that I think fits the definition of a classic, namely the kind of book that's going to wear us out long before we will ever wear it out. Sometimes I read the book simply for its clear statement of essential doctrines and for the gospel principles that are represented there in its texts. Other times I enjoy reading it for the true-to-life spiritual experiences of the great prophets whose words are on its pages. Other times I enjoy it because of its great historical accounts, especially the otherwise unrecorded and unique events that are told to us in 3rd Nephi about the visit of Jesus to the temple in Bountiful. But sometimes I read it just because it's a beautiful book, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Some of its literary aspects, seeing how it is a beautiful book written in a way, in many cases, that is quite surprising to us as 20th century readers. It contains a great deal of beauty, artistry, and some real gems of great literature. In this mode, I'm less interested in generating proofs of the Book of Mormon than searching for appreciation and for understanding. Although Joseph Smith himself said that it would be by circumstantial evidence that the world would prove him to be a true prophet, as they did Moses and other prophets. But in this connection, it's in the details that much of our greatest appreciation for Joseph Smith and for the Book of Mormon emerges. And so, in order to look at the literary composition of the Book of Mormon, we have to turn to some of the specific details and see what we find there. Now, of course, not all people have viewed the Book of Mormon in this light as great literature. Mark Twain, for example, you'll remember, once said that if you take all the "and it came to passes" out, you simply have a small pamphlet. On another occasion, he said that the Book of Mormon is chloroform in print. He missed a good one. He could have added, it even has a book called Ether. Others have seen the style of the Book of Mormon as stilted, awkward, random, boring, and repetitive. And in some ways they're right, especially judged by 19th century literary standards. Now, the book is not great literature by those standards, but when it's judged against the standards of the source and the origins that it claims for itself, namely those of the ancient world, we get a much different and much better assessment of the book. Of all the details in the Book of Mormon that enhance my appreciation of its beauty and artistic achievement, none is more impressive to me than the presence of chiasmus and very extensive and precise examples of this literary form. Chiasmus, it's spelled C-H-I-A-S-M-U-S, is a literary art form. It's a variety of parallelism. A parallel couplet would be two lines where the order of the events or the words is in one sequence and then repeated in the same order the second time. This would be a form of direct parallelism. A chiasm, and by the way, the word chiasm comes from the Greek letter chi, which many of you know looks like an X, and it represents a kind of crisscrossing. And it's a kind of form where you go through a list or a series in one order and then turn around and go through the same list or something very comparable to it in parallel structure, but in the opposite order. English poets may have chosen to write in a sonnet form with its specific line structure. Of course, we find no sonnets anywhere in the Book of Mormon, but many Israelite prophets and poets chose to write in parallelisms and in chiasms. Let me give you a couple examples of a direct parallelism. If you turn to Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1, and the Proverbs are full of good examples of direct parallelisms. Proverbs 15:1 says, "A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger." You can see how those three elements, those two lines, are parallel to each other, each element having a corresponding part in the parallel line that matches it precisely. A good example of an Old Testament chiasm is a relatively substantial five-part chiastic structure in Psalms, Psalm 3, verses 7 and 8. There the poet pleads, and notice these five elements as we go, "Save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies on the cheekbone." And we have those five elements. And then he reverses himself. "The teeth of the wicked thou hast broken, to Jehovah the salvation." You can see this graphically because save me and salvation, the first and the last, correspond with each other. God, in the first part, corresponds with the name Jehovah in the second half. In the first part, it's the enemies that are smitten. Notice the intensification that occurs in the second part, where it's the enemies who are broken, and the wicked who are broken. And at the center we have the cheekbone, which is being smitten in the first half, which is a grievous insult, but it's nothing quite so injurious as the teeth being broken as you have in the second part. You can see in a structure like this how each element in the first portion has its corresponding element in the second, and how they occur in exactly the opposite order. Now, I suppose judged by 20th century standards, these couple of lines would not be acclaimed as the greatest poetry ever written. But to the ancient mind, these lines are composed with beautiful and in a pleasing formal manner. Let me point out just a couple other features of this passage from the Psalm. First of all, its length. Here we have five elements that are repeated in exactly the opposite order. We find a number of shorter chiasms, such as the first shall be last and the last shall be first. There are many of those. They're less significant than the longer ones, because the more extensive and complex the structure is, the more likely it is that the text writer intentionally composed the passage the way that he did. Notice how tight this passage is as well. There's no word that is really out of order. There are no random omissions that we've had to make in order to see this form emerging from the text. Virtually every word in these sentences figures into the passage in an important way. And each element unambiguously mirrors the other. We don't have to sit and explain very much to see that this is exactly what's going on. In other words, it's very objectively present in this particular text. Judged by criteria that biblical scholars and others have developed, we can certainly conclude that this passage in Psalm 3 is a chiastic passage. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the less significant factors later, but this one is certainly a very good one. You have to have criteria in order to judge whether a passage is chiastic or not. Otherwise, we could talk about chiasms in the telephone book. You could go along looking for a Tom, Dick, and Harry and keep finding them, and pretty soon you'll find a Harry, Dick, and Tom, and you're, but we wouldn't call that a chiasm. There's more to it than simply inverted random repetition. I also like here in this particular psalm the great feeling of unity that the form gives, and a sense of completeness that you have as you emerge out of this text to the end of it. You have intensification, a lot of very skillful things at work here in the hand of a good poet. David was not only a great king and prophet, but a very skillful writer, and we see that in the way in which we can dissect this poem and see that it truly is a great work of literary art. Let me give you another example that I think is even more astonishing. One of the better examples in the Old Testament. This is Leviticus chapter 24, verses 13 to 23. Here we have the example or the law given of what should be done when someone has committed blasphemy. It's the story about the son of an Egyptian man and a Hebrew mother who got into a brawl and in the middle of the fight spoke the ineffable or unspeakable name of Jehovah. There wasn't a law at the time telling the Israelites what they should do under these circumstances, and so they went to Moses asking for a ruling in the case. And this text gives us the holding, which, as you'll see, was that the man should be taken out and stoned. This was a capital offense. The text reads, I won't go through it all, but the Lord spoke unto Moses, bring forth him that has cursed without the camp, let all that heard him stone him. Thou shalt speak this unto the children of Israel, whosoever curseth his God shall bear his sin, the stranger as well as he that is born in the land. And he that killeth any man shall surely be put to death, and he that killeth a beast shall make it good, beast for beast. And if a man cause a blemish in his neighbor, so shall it be done unto him. And we have a list there, killing a man, killing a beast, and causing a blemish. And then we have at the very center of this text, breach for breach, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And then it begins to revert. He that causeth a blemish in a man, so shall it be done unto him. And he that killeth a beast shall restore it. And he that killeth a man, he shall be put to death. For ye shall have one law for the stranger as well as of your own country. Notice that that was in the prelude material to this text. And Moses spake unto the children of Israel, bring forth him that cursed out of the camp, and stone him with stones. And they did as the Lord commanded Moses. That's a complete text. Each of the elements, even though it's a legal text, where we wouldn't expect to find great literary works of art emerging, we have here a very clear example of this repetition. And I think it serves an important purpose in this particular case, because what Moses is teaching the people is a principle of God's justice, that justice should be balanced, that it should match the nature of the crime, and it should be applied even-handedly. And the chiastic form gives that kind of balance. It shows this the nature of the reciprocal, what we call talionic justice, which is a part of the Israelite jurisprudence. Well, that's a very interesting and perfect example of this form being used to convey even jurisprudential material. And although perfectly obvious once it's pointed out to a person, this pattern and mode of composition in Leviticus has not been frequently noticed. When I presented a paper to the Jewish Law Association in Boston a few years ago, this is a very eminent body of Jewish legal scholars, they were all quite intrigued and somewhat surprised to have this pointed out to them for the first time. The use of chiasmus is not exclusively Hebrew. It appears in other ancient literatures. My master's thesis on this subject dealt with the use of chiasm in the Ugaritic texts, in classical Greek and Latin authors. It can also appear in some modern texts, but it doesn't appear nearly as extensively or as purposefully as we find it in the ancient world. Let me give you an example from the Odyssey. When Odysseus comes to meet his mother in the underworld, Anticlea, his mother, asks him a series of 7 questions. Interestingly, Odysseus turns around and answers those 7 questions in exactly the opposite order. Once again, we see here a pattern or a structuring device that gave order and system to the way in which words and ideas were presented. And it was something, I think, that the ancient mind had grown accustomed to. In fact, one classical author commented that chiasmus was as natural to these writers as mother's milk. I don't know about that, but it certainly was something that came familiarly to them. It was something that I think they were trained in, and they did with a great degree of precision and purposefulness. That little passage from the Odyssey, by the way, is explained in the book Rediscovering the Book of Mormon and a few other places like that if you're interested in reading more about that. Well, let me tell you a little bit about my discovery of chiasmus in the Book of Mormon. As I mentioned, it was in Regensburg, Germany, in 1967, when I was serving there as a missionary, that I first learned about chiasmus in biblical studies and then came to find it also in the Book of Mormon. Regensburg is a beautiful town, well-preserved medieval city situated on the northernmost bend of the Danube River in Bavaria. In this town, which has been a center of German Catholicism for many years, there were a number of Catholic bookstores and theological seminaries. My companion and I decided that it would be worthwhile to spend a little time getting to know some of the people who taught and worked in the theological seminaries and in these bookstores. And so we took our free day. We had what we called in those days a diversion day, to attend some lectures at one of the theological seminaries that was primarily geared for training young Catholic priests. And one of the first lectures that we heard dealt with the New Testament and literary forms there. The scholar was very excited about having just read a book by a man named Paul Gechter. He's a Jesuit from Innsbruck. It was called The Literary Art in the Gospel of Matthew. And the lecture dealt with the quest that New Testament scholars have been involved in for a number of years, trying to sort out whether Mark or Matthew is closer to the original voice of Jesus. Now, the problem here is that the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were all written in Greek. But Jesus and Peter and all of the original disciples were Hebrew. They were Jewish. And so their thought patterns and their culture were Jewish, fundamentally. And so in trying to go back and rediscover the Jewish elements and the more original, should we say, primitive portions of Christianity from the earliest days, scholars are interested in detecting Jewish elements wherever they can. And chiasmus proved to be one of those elements that helped to find Jewish thought in the Gospel of Matthew. This particular scholar was convinced, although this is certainly debatable, that Matthew uses chiasmus more than Mark, and therefore he thought this was some support for the primacy of the writing of the Gospel of Matthew. Like I say, that's debatable, but the effect on me was very clear. This was an exciting new bit of information that I'd never heard anything about, and I went over to the bookstore quickly and bought this book and began reading a few items and talking to some of the professors to get a few other articles and references that I might check on. A couple weeks later, as I had been pondering about this Hebrew element in the New Testament, I suppose it's only fair that about 4 o'clock in the morning I woke up. I don't usually wake up early in the morning, but I woke up with the words distinctly impressed upon me that if this was something that was evidence of Hebrew style in the Bible, it had to be evidence of Hebrew style in the Book of Mormon. Well, the surprising thing to me about that morning was that I got out of bed. Stumbled over to the desk. It was still dark. Went over to where my companion and I had been reading in the Book of Mormon the night before. Every night we read to each other in German out of the Book of Mormon. One of the main reasons we did that was to reinforce each other's bad German accents. But we had been reading the night before in King Benjamin's speech, as it turned out. I had no idea where to start looking for something like this. So I said, well, I guess where the book is open is just about as good a place as any. I read through the first part of King Benjamin's speech, didn't see anything. Read through chapter 3, chapter 4. Was about ready to go back to bed when I turned the page on chapter 5. And here it is, if this is in fact the book that I was reading that morning, I think if it hadn't have been for a fluke in the typesetting, I probably never would have spotted this. But as you can see right here in Mosiah chapter 5, verse 11, we have two German words, Übertretung, which happen to get typeset right on top of each other. And they happen to be the central two words in the chiasm of Mosiah chapter 5, verses 10 to 12. If you'll take out your text, let me just read through this. There are 6 elements. Let's count them as we go along, and look how Benjamin then retraces his steps in order to complete his thought through the use of chiasmus. Verse 10 begins, "And now it shall come to pass that whosoever shall not take upon him the name of Christ," that's number 1, the name, "must be called," that's number 2, "by some other name. Therefore he findeth himself on the left hand of God." That's number 3, the left hand. And he continues, "I would that ye should remember," that's element number 4, remember, "also that this is the name that I said I should give unto you, that never should be blotted out," that's number 5, "except it be through transgression." That's number 6. He even gives us a marker that we are now at the center. He says, "Therefore," which is the turning point, "take heed that ye do not transgress, that the name be not blotted out of your hearts. I say unto you, I would that ye should remember to retain the name written always in your hearts, that ye are not found on the left hand of God," that was element number 3, "but that ye hear and know the voice by which ye shall be called," which was element number 2, "and also the name by which he shall call you." Well, this is the first example of chiasmus that was found in the Book of Mormon. Notice several things about it. Its length is admirable. The 6 elements is longer than average. Its precision. It certainly has a very precise repetition. And it's objective. It's right there in the text. As you look at it, it's unmistakable. Anybody being asked to see if there is a repetition or an inverted order in there will come up with the same one that we've just gone through. There are 6 perfectly matched elements throughout. I think that there's fairly strong evidence here that Benjamin is doing this consciously. The phrase, "left hand of God," the ones who do not take upon them the name of Christ will be found on the left hand of God. That phrase appears only twice in all of the Book of Mormon. Once in Mosiah chapter 5, verse 10, and the second time in Mosiah chapter 5, verse 12. And so I think the repetition there is quite intentional. The intensification that occurs is interesting to note as well. Notice in the first time that he just says, "I would that ye should remember that this is the name I said I would give you." But in the second half, he wants you to remember something a little more important. That is, that you should always retain this name written in your hearts, so that it becomes a little more personal and intense thing. Well, this is a fine utilization and really gives double emphasis, kind of a double warning, almost with legal effect. You remember the 2-witness rule of the Israelite law, that you shall always hear things twice. In fact, there's a passage in Job, Job 33, verse 14, that says, "Yea, the Lord speaketh once, yea, twice, and man still perceiveth it not." So I think that there's, again, intentionality in the use of this form, especially in very solemn and important circumstances. Well, you can imagine how excited we were as missionaries to find something like this. We even went out and used it as a door approach that day. I've often wondered what those housefraus and workmen thought as we told them that there was chiasmus in the Book of Mormon. They didn't know what the Book of Mormon was, let alone chiasmus. So I'm sure they thought we were crazier than ever, but it was an exciting thing for us, one of the most thrilling parts of my life. Let me give you another one from Benjamin's speech, because it is such a masterful address. This is Mosiah chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. In fact, if you put into the computer the words in King Benjamin's speech and count the number of words, just using his and not the editorial introductions and so on, and then divide by 2 and figure out where the exact center of the speech is, it's right here. And so this particular turning point is a focal point of all of King Benjamin's masterful speech in Mosiah chapters 2 to 5. Notice the elements here. It begins by saying, "Men drink damnation unto their own souls except," and here is the important proviso, "they humble themselves and become as little children." That's humble is number 1, children number 2. "And believe that salvation was and is to come in and through the atoning blood of Christ the Lord omnipotent. For the natural man is the enemy to God, and has been from the fall of Adam, and will be forever and ever. That's the turning point. Has been and will be, unless he yieldeth to the enticings of the Holy Spirit. That's the contrast to the enemy of God. Putteth off the natural man. Natural man had been mentioned earlier. Becometh a saint through the atonement of Christ the Lord. That was mentioned at the end of verse 18. And becometh as a child, submissive, meek, humble, and so on. Now look at the content of this passage. What is this all about? It's about the necessity of taking advantage of the atoning blood of Christ the Lord omnipotent. That is the central point, the turning point of all the gospel. Benjamin makes it the turning point, the midpoint of his entire speech. And the entire speech revolves around his testimony of the atoning mission of Jesus Christ. What more fitting center point could possibly be given to a speech than this one? And the way it's structured pinpoints it through the chiastic middle there. Look at another one, Helaman chapter 6, verses 7 to 13. I like this one, and you can read about this in more detail in the book called Re-Exploring the Book of Mormon. This is chapter 66 in this particular book. I like this one because it embraces the entire annual record for the 64th year of the reign of Judges. And the whole thing is written, I think, as a gem, as a literary gem, a little chiasm. The great event of that year was that there was peace and prosperity for the first time for over several generations in both the land to the north and the land to the south. People were able to travel for the first time between these lands freely. This was an incredibly important event in the lives of these people, and the monument that they left to that great year of peace was a chiastic structure that balanced the land to the north and the land to the south to show that a degree of equality and interchange between the two had truly been created and succeeded there. I won't go through the entire thing, but it begins in verse 7 of Helaman 6. Behold, there was peace in all the land. They then mention that both the Lamanites and the Nephites had become rich. They had plenty of gold and silver and all manner of metals, both in the land to the south and the land to the north. And then, in verse 10, at the end of verse 9, you have this interesting little center point. Now the land south was called Lehi, and the land north was called Mulek, which was after the son of Zedekiah. For the Lord did bring Mulek to the land north, and Lehi into the land south. You follow how that goes? South, Lehi, north, Mulek, and then Mulek north, Lehi south, right through the opposite order. And right at the turning point is the identification of Mulek as the son of Zedekiah, and that ending, the IAH ending on the end of Zedekiah's name, is a theophoric suffix, which I think would have paralleled the next word, for the Lord, which would have been Jehovah. So you have, right at the turning point, a double mention of the name of Jehovah. Divinity often appears at the center of these very important chiasms. The message of that is that it was only through the Lord that this great peace was brought into the lives of these people in the 64th year of the reign of the Judges. Now that little chiasm is hardly even, well, parts of it are perfectly obvious in English, but that last little point wouldn't have been obvious except for someone reading the text in Hebrew. Following that, you then retrace your steps to the end of the annual entry. For behold, there was all manner of gold in both of these lands, and all manner of precious ore, and so on, and they did become rich. Prosperity in both lands is discussed, and thus the 64th year did pass away in peace. So you end exactly where the annual record began. So that's, I think, a choice little piece there. How about 1st Nephi? Sometimes these structuring devices can be used to embrace and give order to a larger composition. The story that we have in 1st Nephi was not written by Nephi until later in his life. This is not his first time through the story, and I think as he sat down to give us the final version, He had had time to reflect on some of the very interesting nuances of his own experiences with his brothers and so on. And he wanted to couch the great spiritual experiences that he had had in beautiful artistic terms. And he does so with great balance and with artistry throughout 1st Nephi. Now, there are different ways in which this text can be analyzed, and the larger the texts get, the more subject they are to possible interpretations and various ways of viewing the text. These texts that we've been looking at so far are very tight and very concise. Not much room for debate about the structure there. But one way in which to look at the passage, the whole text of 1st Nephi, is to simply think of the number of things that occur twice in the book, and then build the structure around some of those. How many times does Nephi get tied up? It gets tied up twice. Once in chapter 7, out in the desert, and again in chapter 18 in the ship. How many brass things are mentioned? Well, there are 2. First of all, there's the brass ball, the brass plates in the first half of the book, which are a great spiritual guide from the Lord. And in the second half, you have the brass ball, which also is another form of spiritual director from the Lord. How about steel objects? We have 2 of those as well. In the first half, we have the steel sword, sword of Laban, and in the second half, the steel bow that breaks. How many times does Nephi succeed at something that his brothers say couldn't happen, and how many times do his brothers try to thwart him physically at these 2 great missions? Well, we have the attempt to get the plates, where the brothers object to that, and Nephi succeeds in doing that where his brothers said it couldn't be done, and then in chapter 17 at the end, he builds the ship. Also something they said simply couldn't happen. And notice there that chapter 3, verse 7, the very famous verse, I will go and do the things which the Lord hath commanded, has a parallel that we've almost always overlooked. Chapter 17, verse 3, the second story of Nephi succeeding where his brothers failed, also begins with a text that is almost word for word the same. So as you look at this, you do have framing elements that center around the very middle of the book. And what's at the middle? Lehi's vision of the tree of life, Nephi's experience of that same vision, and then finally Nephi's interpretation of Lehi's dream. Well, little things like that. Ishmael, for example, is mentioned twice in the book. In chapter 7, when they go up to get the daughters of Ishmael, and in chapter 16, when they marry the daughters of Ishmael, and Ishmael died. Now, I don't believe for a minute that Laman and Lemuel waited all that time to marry the daughters of Ishmael. I think once they got them, they married them. They didn't wait till chapter 16 came along to have that happen. In other words, what we have in the Book of Mormon is in 1st Nephi is not chronologically based so much as artistically and literarily. And chiasmus may be a factor in the way in which that's being presented. Well, one other quick one to mention is a recently discovered passage from Alma chapter 33, verses 4 to 11. This is a very archaic poem by the Israelite prophet Zenus, which is quoted by Alma in Alma chapter 33. Notice how this poem begins with the poet out in the desert, in the remote wilderness because of his enemies. It comes home through the fields to his house and into his most intimate closet. And in all of those places, the prophet affirms that the Lord had heard his prayer. The poet then turns around and from his closet speaks of children, moving outwardly toward the congregations, and finally the poem ends once again with the Lord still hearing him, even though he is an outcast, presumably in the wilderness, outcast because of his enemies. So you have, I think, a very beautiful illustration of the way in which prayer is heard, whether you are out in the wilderness, in the most remote place, God will hear you there, or in the most intimate closet. From one extreme to the other, the prophet is telling us, the Lord will hear and answer. And notice how that two-way composition also, I think, adds to the two-way nature of prayer, that it's a communication between the Lord and the prophet. And anytime you have this bi-part structure in a text, you have dialogue going on right within the text. I think that may be an element of it also. Let's turn next to Alma chapter 41. Here we have in verses 13 to 15 one of the most creative uses of chiasmus anywhere in world literature. Alma is speaking on this occasion to his son Corianton. And you remember he needed to teach Corianton something about the principles of justice. After all, Corianton had transgressed some important commandments, and he misunderstood the nature of the restoration of God. Somehow Corianton had been taught and had believed that God would restore all people to a state of paradise and happiness. And Alma had to say, no, the meaning of the word restoration does not mean to restore you all to happiness, but to bring back good for good, evil for evil, and so on. Notice what's going on here is very similar to what we saw in Leviticus chapter 24. This is, once again, teaching something about the reciprocal nature of the concept of justice. And so just as Leviticus 24 used chiasm to impress upon the minds of readers that point, Alma will do the same, using chiasm here to make a very powerful point to his son Corianton. In fact, he says, and look at how this works out, the meaning of the word restoration is to bring back good for good, righteous for righteous, justice for justice, and mercy for mercy. Therefore, he says, see that thou art merciful, deal justly, judge righteously, and do good continually. If ye do these things, then ye shall have your reward. Yea, ye shall have mercy restored unto you. Ye shall have justice rewarded unto you. Ye shall have a righteous judgment rewarded unto you. And ye shall have good rewarded unto you. Therefore, the meaning of the word restoration more fully condemneth the sinner and justifieth him not at all. Look what Alma has done here. First of all, he gives us a list of pairs: good for good, righteous for righteous, just for just, and mercy for mercy. Then he turns around and gives us a pair of lists in the opposite order. And in the process, he says, if you want to have good, you must be good. Therefore, be good and you will get good. So he reverses the substantives and the predicatives in the first list of pairs. And when he gives us, this is very confusing, I know, but as you get it into the second half in the pair of lists, he gives you, first of all, the be good, the predicatives, and then you will get good, the substantives. And these four elements all appear in the opposite order. This is very, very creative. I've never seen anything like this in terms of ancient or modern uses of a form. And what I think is happening here is that this is really consistent with what else is going on in Nephite civilization at this time. Alma lived at a great time of renaissance in Nephite culture. And this is a time of individual rights where people are given legal protections that they've never been given before, new weights and measures, military innovations, a lot of political change that's going on at this time, reading and writing, emphasis on that, which had been renewed under King Benjamin, who was emphatic about his sons needing to learn the old texts and languages. I think what you have in Alma is a real Renaissance man, and he is able to take these old classical forms and use them in an extremely creative way to teach the point that he wants his son to understand, that the meaning of the word restoration is you better be good if you want to get good rewards from the Lord. But the greatest chiastic composition that I know of anywhere that we want to spend our last few minutes on here is Alma chapter 36, the entire chapter. Once again, this is a text written by Alma, and that's consistent with his overall style, to see him using this form so extensively as he does here in Alma 36. Here chiasmus is used not only as a framing and organizing device, but as a powerful means to focus the reader's attention precisely on what constituted the turning point of not only Alma's chapter, but of his entire life. So let's take a look at this in some detail. Let me just read this through, and as you follow along in the text, this begins with verse 1 of Alma 36. Alma, by the way, here is speaking to his firstborn son, Helaman, and the firstborn son was always entitled to a double blessing. Perhaps the repetition here is Alma's own very creative way of giving his son the double birthright blessing that would belong to Helaman. He says, "My son, give ear to my words." You can just underline some of these as we put them in for emphasis. "My words, for inasmuch as ye shall keep the commandments of God, ye shall prosper in the land. I would that ye should do as I have done." That "as I" will show up later as well. "In remembering the captivity of our fathers. For God did deliver them, and surely none could deliver them," he says, "save it be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore he admonishes, whosoever shall put their trust in God," underline the word trust, "shall be supported," notice, supported in their trials, troubles, and afflictions. In the next couple of verses, Alma then explains that he knows this, not of the carnal mind, but of the spiritual mind, for he has been born of God. Take special note of that word, born. And he then explains how it was that he was converted, how he had gone about persecuting the church, underline church or something of that nature. But then an angel had appeared to him, and after making certain statements to him, Alma reports how his limbs had become paralyzed. For 3 days, Alma lost the use of his limbs, and while in this state, his soul was tormented. First of all, he feared coming into the presence of God to be judged for the wrongs that he had done. He says, "My mind suffered the pains of the damned soul," he says, and says that he was harrowed up. Underline the words harrowed up to the greatest degree. While Alma was suffering in that very extreme state, he says, "My mind caught upon the fact that my father had spoken about one Jesus Christ, a Son of God who would come to atone for the sins of the world." And that was the turning point of his life. And at that point he says, "Yea, I did cry out, O Jesus, thou Son of God, have mercy on me who am in the gall of bitterness." Notice that Jesus, a Son of God, occurs twice, right at the center turning point of that chapter. Well, as he did that, he says, he could feel no more pain. "I was harrowed up by my sins no more." He says, "Oh, what joy, what marvelous light." He even makes an explicit contrast between his joy then and his prior pain. "Yea, my joy was as exceeding as had been my pain." This is one of the rare occasions where I think we're almost getting a writer telling us, by the way, notice I'm doing this. I'm repeating myself purposely, drawing an explicit comparison between the prior pain and the present joy. Well, then he goes on. What's the next thing he wishes for? He now wants to come into the presence of God. Before he had feared standing before God, but now, quoting Lehi from 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 8, and by the way, there's an extensive quote there, verbatim, of Lehi's words. He now wishes to come into the presence of God and to join in the choir singing and praising the Lord. Well, he then backs out, repeating himself throughout as the use of his limbs returns. He then explains how he spent the rest of his life preaching to people, building up the church, that they might become born of God as he had been born, and therefore that they might know that, as he knows, that whosoever shall put their trust in God shall be supported in all of their trials and troubles. Now remember, before he said trials, troubles, and afflictions. Notice here in the second half he says supported in all of their trials, troubles, yea, in all of their afflictions. He's not going to miss even that word. And he puts the yea in for emphasis, as if again to call attention to the fact that this is an explicit repetition. Therefore he says, "I will put my trust in God." That word was up there above as well. "And he shall deliver me just as he delivered our fathers. For they were in captivity in Egypt and in Jerusalem and in the land of Nephi. Therefore he says, "My son, do as I have done, for inasmuch as ye do keep the commandments, ye shall prosper in the land, and this is according to God's word." he ends with the Word, which is where he began. Well, this chapter is simply amazing. It truly is one of the great masterpieces of literature, perfectly consistent with the ancient form. I think it's one of the ultimate developments of the use of this style of writing. I can't imagine an author taking this to a more perfect implementation than what Alma has done here. It is simply an exquisite implementation of all of the chiastic principles. As a framing mechanism, it tells you exactly what embraced the conversion of Alma. It, with precision and length and turning point, it's simply a marvelous way in which Alma has been able to capture the turning point when he called upon Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That was the turning point of his life. He wanted us all, and his son especially, to know that that was the turning point of his entire life, and he makes it then the turning point of this chapter and this blessing. Well, as you might imagine, with things as interesting as this, there are quite a number of questions that people might have about Chiasmus and what else has happened in years since then. Do any of you have any questions that you'd like to ask? Yes?
How can we be sure that these patterns were in the original text? Because the Book of Mormon is simply a translation.
That's right. What we have in the Book of Mormon is just an English translation, but interestingly, as you think of all of the different poetical devices that writers might use, like rhyme and meter, alliteration, and other things, this basic organizational structure is the most likely to survive a fairly literal translation, at least one that's going concept for concept. We can't be sure. I'd love to see what the original underlying texts were. So we always have to caveat our studies in the Book of Mormon by not knowing for sure what the underlying text was, but every indication that we have is that at least the passages that I've given you today and others like them were probably very readily discernible in the underlying text. I think something like the use of the Zedekiah and the name of the Lord at the center of the passage in Helaman shows that we're talking about something that was in the original text. That only works in Hebrew. So there again. Any other? Yes?
Were ancient people conscious of this pattern of writing? Did they write this way on purpose?
Well, intentionality is always a difficult thing for us to judge. In a few cases, like I've mentioned with Alma, it's almost like he's leaving us a little marginal note saying, notice that this comparison is intentional. But we always have to be subjective, and we have to evaluate the degree of plausibility that an author was doing this intentionally. It is possible for some of these things, especially the short ones, to simply occur inadvertently, or perhaps it's like a musician who knows how to ad-lib, or, you know, a musician who can just sit down and play something by ear. Are they doing that intentionally? Well, sometimes they do some wonderful things that they haven't sat down and planned out in advance. But because of their great training and familiarity with the instrument and the music, things just come out that way. Now, it is interesting that some of the commentators in Alexandria, Egypt, in the 2nd century B.C., called the scholiasts, gave us commentaries on some of the early classical writers, and they had a term for this. They called it hysteron proteron, which means the last first. And when they noted it in Homer or in Sophocles or other writers, they would indicate that this was something that was being done. So there was certainly a fair degree of awareness of this in the ancient world, and I think the fact that it helps people so much in memorizing a text. If you know this organization, it's so easy to sit down and memorize these passages, at least even long passages, that I think we ought to give the ancients credit for intentionally knowing what they were doing and using it for the many great uses that it was worth. Yes?
How much chiasm was known in Joseph Smith's day?
In Joseph Smith's day, not very much. In the 1820s, there were a couple ecclesiastical writers in the Church of England a man named John Jebb and another named Thomas Boys, who began writing books based on some Latin texts that had been produced in the 18th century, dealing with chiasm in the Bible. Now, their texts, for the most part, were interested in all varieties of parallelism. The John Jebb book called Sacred Literature, for example, only has a few pages on chiasm. But we can see the emergence of scholarly awareness of this. Those books are very rare. I've looked around and have not found copies of them in libraries in this country. I was able to find the Thomas Boys material in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. But I don't know, I really seriously doubt that those books had made their way to the United States by 1830. And if they had, I even more seriously doubt that Joseph Smith had read them. And if he had, he would still be left with the very formidable task of taking a form that was quite undeveloped and at that stage really quite debatable. This wasn't something that people just latched onto immediately. It took several years, and in fact it wasn't until the 1950s and 60s in our own lifetimes that biblical scholars have really understood the extent and proper use of chiasmus. So I think that there was really very, very little chance, what should we say, a statistically insignificant chance that Joseph Smith had any awareness of this through regular scholarly channels. When he translated the Book of Mormon, he's down in Harmony, Pennsylvania. He's, as far as I know, quite a number of miles from any library. People have looked at the Palmyra Library as a possible source of Joseph Smith's ideas, but he's 110 miles away from Palmyra at the time he's doing this work. So I think that there wasn't very much known about this at that time.
Yes? I think there's a connection between Nephi's statement, the Lord's work is one eternal round, and the chiasmus seems to be the same sort of structure where you start, where you...
I think there may be a distant connection there. The ancient worldview saw more things in cyclical patterns than we do. Cycles of history repeating itself, patterns where life cycles, annual cycles went through an eternal round. And it may well be that chiasm is somehow an indirect, perhaps subconscious reflection of that. No indication that that particular phrase was ever used in a literary mode. Yes.
Recognizing that Joseph Smith would not likely have had access to scholarly studies on chiasm, he was a student of the Bible. Might he not have noticed it and been impressed with it from there? And if so, might one not expect him to have made use of it in his own writings and sermons?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Joseph Smith, of course, did know the Bible, the King James Bible, very, very well. Interesting to me is that some of these chiasms, some of them that I've given you, like the third Psalm, are obscured by the English translators because this inverted word order is not a natural word order for good English. And so he would have had to have had an incredible sense of literary astuteness in order to have picked this up by some kind of subconscious osmosis or assimilation. There are no patterns anywhere nearly as precise or purposeful as Alma 36 or Alma 41 or Mosiah 5, anywhere else in Joseph Smith's writings or revelations. Some people have suggested that there might be some of these in the Doctrine and Covenants. But in my judgment, if you apply objective criteria, I believe that the degree of chiasm, if it exists at all in those other texts, is minimal to insignificant. But there again, further study may be necessary. But I don't see anything like Alma 36 anywhere else in Joseph Smith's writing, and that one is, I think, really an important test case. That sort of thing just doesn't happen accidentally. This book has been a great joy and delight in my life. The Book of Mormon is a wonderful text. It's a precious treasure. I pray that it will be a fully realized blessing in each of your lives. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.